What is up, PMC fam? It is your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer here, with my very last episode of previews before I pass you off to Kid the Kid. And if you ain't familiar, you ain't been listening, so double back for Coach V and Gino's previews to understand what the status quo is. But let me lay it down for you real quick. We talk about how the team did last year, who they lost in their senior class, who they'll be returning, and look ahead to the upcoming season. So let's go ahead and talk about this last batch of 1A teams from my squads. The very first team is going to be from one of the most competitive leagues that we have here in Colorado, and that is the 1A North Central here. And we're going to talk about the team that unfortunately finished at the bottom last year, but still had some interesting games in Burlington here. Last year, they had quite the schedule last season, losing to two 2A playoff teams before getting a win over an out-of-state opponent in Goodland here by 11. They would then lose a close game to Lamar 21-14. That would be their best showing for the remainder of the season, as heading into league would not yield any wins, and they end up finishing the season 1-8. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the graduated seniors here. They had a few guys here, such as Angel Vela here, who was the starting quarterback who led in touches, throwing 5 scores and rushing for 2. And then he would also go for over 600 total scrimmage yards and was also tied for the team lead in fumble recoveries and forced fumbles at 2 apiece, while recording 54 tackles and 3 of those for loss. They also lost Luis Enriquez here, who had the second most rushing yards with 167 and a score. They also lose Rodolfo Estrada Acosta here, who had over 200 yards receiving and rushing combined as a senior. And then Keziah Williams, who had some big catches last year, going for 140 yards, while also leading all seniors in interceptions, and was overall second on the team with 3. Now, who is he second on the team to? Well, that's for the returning playmakers to talk about, such as Scout Humrich here. Really wish I could get my hands on his film here, as he recorded 4 interceptions and was an athlete on offense, making some moves. They also returned back Anthony Estrada here, who had 2 fumble recoveries as a sophomore and was just one aspect of his game here, as he did lead with 5.5 sacks and was third in tackles with 42, along with a team-high 12 TFLs his sophomore season. They also bring back Stanton Cure, who had 2.5 sacks and 16 more hurries on his junior year, while also leading the whole squad in tackles at 85 and notching 10 of those for loss. Now, this is a pretty incomplete schedule here for Burlington, but, based off what they're returning, I'm hoping that they're a bit more competitive this year than maybe they were last year, but I still don't know if they necessarily beat anyone in their league other than maybe Yuma, but even then, I definitely have Yuma favored. They have Goodland and Denver Christian currently scheduled here, and, I even looked at their school website. I am a little worried about their ability to maybe field a team this season, just with the lack of scheduling here, but Goodland and Denver Christian are 2 games that they have there. They might be able to beat Denver Christian, especially because it is at home, and maybe they repeat their success against Goodland. I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here and say that their window of wins is probably between 0 to 3, and that they end up winning 2 games this season, going 2-7. So, yeah, with as little information as I have, these are complete shots in the dark borderline, just knowing what their league is like and how competitive it is. And, knowing that they're probably going to have to get those 2 wins outside of league. So I am intrigued on what their out-of-league schedule will be. Now, next up in this league are the Holyoke Dragons, and last season was quite the season for them, riding a strong class of 24 to an awesome season, ripping off 6 straight wins to start the season, with notable wins over Strasburg, 2 out-of-state teams on the road to Colby, and then at home against Hershey, then 2 road league wins over Wray and Wiggins, scoring over 30 points in all games. Their win streak finally came to a close against the Badgers, who got the best of the Dragons 28-22, but then they would bounce back with 40 burgers over Yuma and Burlington en route to the playoffs. Once in the playoffs, they then shut out Platte Canyon in the first round, but were upset in the second round by the Wray Eagles to disappointingly end their season via a score of 41-35. Now, I talk highly of this class of 24, and who are some of the guys that I'm talking about here? Well, I cannot talk about 1A football and especially the Holyoke Dragons season without Wyatt Sprague, who was the key, throwing for 32 touchdowns and running for another 7, accounting for over 3,000 yards throwing, running, intercepting, and anything else under the sun, going for 140 tackles and 4 sacks. This linebacker, quarterback, running back, and every single position beasted last year, culminating in a BA senior season that will leave a mark on this town for some time. This Dragon squad also had Tyson Mossentine here, who was the lead ball carrier outside of Wyatt in touches, but no one in yards and scores, going for 623 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns on his lonesome, while being an incredible check down option, picking up 298 receiving yards and another 4 touchdowns. At the receiver position, Bryson Dirks and Cash Weber combined for over 1,000 yards and 16 total touchdowns. And defensively, Weber led the team with 5 interceptions as well as 5 pass breakups. And then Dirks led the squad in pass breakups with a whopping 13. Overall, from the defense, this Dragon squad does lose 228 solo tackles and some serious size up front, but they do still have some talent coming back, such as Reed Sprague, who was impertinent to the big play ability of this offense last year, going for 715 yards and 8 touchdowns while averaging nearly 20 yards per reception. Defensively, he was third on the team with 84 tackles and then also recorded 3 sacks and 3 picks and was second in the passing breakup category with 11. Trey Oakley was somebody who took advantage of some throws going his way, picking up 204 yards and 4 scores. And then we have a younger Weber here in Colby, who had 2 interceptions, being the most of any underclassman his sophomore year. Cody Maloney will return as he was over 100 tackles as a junior and is part of 2 returners that were in the top 3. And overall, 7 of the top 11 tacklers will return, with Roberts, Colner, Oakley, Dominguez, and Weber all notching over 30 tackles. So this defense should somewhat be intact. They obviously lose some big play ability, and this offense is going to be looking for a quarterback here. Not sure if they're going to slide Reed Sprague over or what exactly their plan is there, but looking at Holyoke's schedule for this season, they start off against Glen Rock, Wyoming. I think that should be a win. Then they face off against Colby. Colby was a middle-of-the-road team last year that they did beat pretty good, and Colby went 4-5 last year. But looking at some of their contributors, at least according to their stats, they should be returning some pretty good talent here, at least at the quarterback position, with their starter Kaysen Carroll coming back, and he's also kind of a dual threat guy and some of his top receiving options. So that'll be a good test of that Colby offense versus this Holyoke defense. They then play Peyton. This one is at home, fortunately, so that helps out their chance of winning. But that Peyton team is really, really good this season. They're returning some seriously important starters. And then, as of right now, they don't have an August 30th game scheduled, but, we will see what that ends up being. And then they have their league opponents, obviously, which in order has Wray, then Limon, then Yuma, then Wiggins, and then Burlington here. And they got the first round of the playoffs as a TBD. So they are planning on making the postseason, usually playing in this league, especially if you can, finish close to 500, means that. And I think that this team can do that. I think that they are probably in a better spot than a handful of these teams, and that they probably win at bare minimum 3 games this year, but probably no more than 5, honestly. I just think that some of these matchups are going to be a lot tougher than they were last year, and I don't know who's going to be their solution at quarterback. So I'm going to say a window of wins for the Dragons of 3-5, and I'm probably leaning closer to 3-6 right now. That Peyton matchup is going to be really, really big, determining how close this team gets to a 500 record versus finishing more on that 3-6, as well as that unscheduled game that they currently have right now. Depending on what that is, that can make for a 4-5 season. And now, if you are a big fan of 1A, but not the biggest fan of hearing about a very similar result that happens on a year-to-year basis, you might want to skip this section. But if you got a love for greatness and respect for it, We are talking about the Limon Badgers here, who had a very strong class of 24 with a ton of returners from the prior season and still had some solid wins, but arguably looked somewhat beatable at times, despite nothing really confirming that last season. They opened up their season beating 2A Florence by over 30, and then 28-7 was a closer score on the road to Meeker before beating Strasburg 49-21 in their first matchup. And then the last game of non-league was Buena Vista, which they won by 21, which, as I said before, seems a lot closer margin than most years. Heading to league, they put on 50 over Burlington, beat Wray by 28, and then earned a tough win on the road over Holyoke 28-22. This would essentially cement their 1 seed, especially after beating Wiggins and Yuma by over 40. In the postseason, they kept rolling, beating Cedar Ridge 42-7, BLA 41-18, and Meeker by the same score as earlier that season. Meeker once again pushing them probably harder than anyone else in the postseason, and then back down to Pueblo, where they beat Strasburg 50-13 for the chip and to go back-to-back. Now, looking at this class of 24, it was a very strong class as the top 3 rushers were all seniors, headlined by Logan Bottier's primary back season that went swimmingly well as he ran for 1,349 yards and 24 rushing touchdowns, while also doing some returner duties and overall notched over 2,100 yards and 30-plus scores, being one of the best players in 1A and one of the most impactful players in the entire state. His complimentary running mate here was Keon Bandy, who ran for almost 1,000 yards and then caught another 300 yards on the season while also mobbing on defense. And then Jordan Rockwell, his senior year at quarterback was as ideal as you could draw it up, with 17 passing scores and another 8 rushing scores offensively while making an impact defensively as well. His number 1 option was a senior, being Lance Beatty, who caught for over 500 yards and 8 scores, giving this offense an air threat when necessary. In addition to Bandy's placement with over 100 tackles, Bottier, Beatty, Rockwell all made appearances in the top 10 of tacklers, but no one quite rocked the defense like two-way stalwart and top 5 PMC edge player in the class of 24, Trayton Marks, who recorded an insane 30 tackles for loss and 8.5 sacks his senior season. He has been one of the most dominant players in all of Colorado football over the past few years, and so to see him put this cherry on top was nothing short of spectacular and definitely nowhere near surprising given his prior seasons of dominance. Another senior, Nathan Kuntz, here put in some serious work with 58 tackles and 5.5 tackles for loss, which was amongst the best on the squad, and his 3 sacks were second only to the monster Marks here. Turnover-wise, the Badgers will need to replace all interceptions in the secondary with 12 INTs all walking across the stage, headlined by Bandy and Rockwell's 4 apiece, and then Beatty's 3 as well. Bandy also chipping in a team-high 4 fumble recoveries as well, so just so many contributors to replace here, but at the end of the day, this is Limon football here, and so they're going to make do with these returning playmakers, and I know that these guys who didn't get snaps in last year will be ready to go with this coaching staff, but some of them who did get snaps and are ready to come in now include the likes of Skylar McCready here, who should be ready to shoulder a massive workload on this squad, having been the only ball carrier from last year with over 20 carries last season and recording 416 yards on 6 yards per carry. You also return Jacob Jacklich here, who is the only underclassman or non-senior for that matter in the top 6 tacklers at 51 last season and one of 3 sophomores in the top 10, the other ones being Keegan Mellett, Dryson Davis, and there are also 3 more sophomores outside the top 10 in Zach Carr, Scherer, and Kulleth. All of those had over 20 total tackles last season. Now, this class of 26 showed some flashes last season and with his coaching staff remains a team that has to be gone through for any state aspirations. And so let's go ahead and take a look at this schedule. That is another tough schedule for Limon here. Their very first game of the season is down in Colorado Springs at Colorado Christian High School here. Now, Colorado Springs Christian High School, I should say. I believe Gino might be at that game. Don't quote me on that, but that is going to be a premier Week 1 matchup with 2 teams that definitely have playoff talent and aspirations. They then play Flatirons Academy at home, and then they are on the road at Bennett, and then at home versus Buena Vista. This is a tough non-league schedule, and this might be the first time that we see Limon lose in a little while. I do think that they are probably equipped to handle Flatirons Academy as well as Bennett. They're not really a team to lose to kind of one-trick squads or schemes here. But between Colorado Springs Christian and Buena Vista, they probably end up losing one of those games, I would assume. But all in all, I think that 3 to 4 window of wins in non-league play is pretty reasonable. And then all of these teams in their league have to be licking their chops every year. They think it's finally going to be their year here, and Limon kind of just dashes those dreams. Limon does benefit from facing Wiggins and Holyoke at home. I think that they probably go 2-0 in this stretch, and then they play Wray on the road. Wray is definitely not only the biggest threat in their own league to win that league, but also the biggest threat in the state to probably win 1A as well. More on them here in just a couple of minutes. But to continue the schedule, they then have Burlington and Yuma. I still think that those are very winnable games. At worst, they go 3-2 in league, and at worst, they go 2-2 in non-league games. But I just don't think that worst case scenario happens. So I'm not even going to start their window of wins at 5. I'm actually going to start it at 6. And you know what? We always have to put them down as a threat to go undefeated during the regular season. So a window of wins of 6 to 9, I think, is super reasonable here. But I think it's more likely that this team probably goes 8-1 if I have to put a final stamp on their record. I think that they lose 1 of 3 games against Colorado Springs Christian or Buena Vista or Wray, but I could definitely see them going 2-1 in those games and not losing more than 1, especially with how they kind of have it spread out at home. And Colorado Springs Christian, I think that Limon's scheme relies on them being simple and efficient, and I think that that's a great strategy to head into week 1 with. And then they just got to keep everything in front of them against the Lions here to keep control of that game. But it'll be a fantastic game to get a gauge on where Limon is at on their 3P aspirations and if they are a contender for state once again. We're now going to talk about the Tigers of Wiggins, Colorado. And looking at the 23 fall season, despite massive turnover and plenty of key positions, the Tigers continued to find success. They eked out a double overtime win over Brush to start the season and then narrowly lost to state runner-up Strasburg by only 5. They took out those frustrations on their next 3 opponents, though, with Platte Valley keeping their game within a single score, but ultimately just blast through, getting back into that 4-1 setup here. But then they would alternate games, losing to Holyoke before getting a win over Burlington, and then lose their next 2 games to the Badgers and the Eagles. But their first round matchup, they did make the playoffs, that is, was a loss to Banning Lewis Academy, 21-2 to wrap up their season. And so looking at some of the guys who won't be coming back to this team, you can't talk about the Wiggin Tigers last year without Americo Lorenzini. He was Mr. Tiger last year, grinding it out in the trenches while also crunching opposing offensive players 57 times. And he got to the opposing QB 5 times and led all Tigers with Hunter Beach right behind him at 4 in total sacks. Grant Reed was a senior who notched 92 total tackles his senior season, and then Jacob Doran rounds out the top 3 of senior tacklers with a half-century of tackles as well. He was the only senior to notch an interception. But this team is going to look to be even more improved from last year, as this defense outside the top 3 tacklers returns a ton of 20-plus tackle guys, headlined by Schmidt at 41, Walker 39, Mayer 38, and Mendez at 34. And the pass defense is also in a really good spot, as we see Arath Carrasco here, who led the team as a freshman with 2 interceptions, and 4 of the other 5 turnovers return as well. Stevie Linton was a very high snap count guy on the offensive line who looks to continue paving lanes for his future running back. His returning running back, being Jason Lewisberg here, the heart of this offense, rushing for 1,353 yards, as well as catching for another 120, but keeping this offense ground-centric made life a lot easier for the quarterback, who is going to be returning. That is Marcus Steinbar here. Didn't throw often, but was efficient when he did, going to just 4 passing touchdowns to just 1 interception. This offense also leaned on a couple of other juniors like Tyler Dilka, Jorge Mendez, and Steinbar, who as a unit basically matched Lewisburg at 1,300 yards between the three of them, and then rushing for a few touchdowns as well here. So this dynamic trio will look to keep things up here, and this team will run the ball and run it well, and the defense will stiffen up. But it is, interesting to see if the lack of balance maybe puts them in a precarious spot. Let's take a look at the schedule and see if those things are going to be a problem. So their non-league games are going to include at home versus Forge Christian. This is a very winnable game, but this Forge Christian squad does return a ton of talent. Go ahead and listen to Monday's episode on their offense coming back. And then they are on the road against Meeker. That is a tough place to play, and maybe one that they don't pull out. They're then at home versus Highland that they should win, and I do think that they should win this rendition of their game against Strasburg before they get into league play. Now, they don't have all of the league games scheduled, but we know who the league is. It's Limon, it's Holyoke, it's Wray, it's Yuma, and it's Burlington. I think that they should probably beat Yuma and Burlington and probably Holyoke this year, honestly, and then probably struggle against Limon or Wray. If there ever was a season to beat Limon, it would be it, but Wiggins has not been able to shake that off yet, so I'm not going to buy into it until it officially happens. And then as for their regular season that is non-league, I think that they should probably go 3-1. If they do go 2-2, it's a little bit of a surprise, but between 3-1 in non-league and 3-2 in league, this team is looking at a 6-3 season, in my opinion here, and has a window of wins between 5 to 7 probably. I just don't know if they are going to be able to really get 2 wins between their 3 games of Meeker, Limon, and Wray. If they do, that's very impressive, and keeping it to just 1 loss is pretty good here. So I'm actually going to say 5-8 here for the window of wins, but I am definitely projecting the Tigers to go 6-3 and look a lot stronger in the first round of the playoffs when they inevitably play this year. And up next, we will be discussing the Wray Eagles here. Last year, they started off 2-0 big before losing to a tough Scott school on the road out of state, and upon their return, dispatched of Ellicott to go 3-1 in non-league play. However, this would preface 2 tough losses to Holyoke and Limon that kind of put Wray almost squarely at number 3 in the state and especially in this league. So with something to prove, they waxed through the rest of league. Once they were in the playoffs, they did beat Centauri 59-27 in round 1 and then got massive revenge after having lost to Holyoke earlier in the regular season. They beat the Dragons by 6 points to advance to the semifinals, where they would lose a gut-wrencher to Strasburg by a single point. As far as graduating seniors go, it looks like the biggest contributor that they will be losing is Ben Harms. He was tied for the team lead in receptions with 25 and put up 230 yards and a score off those catches. And defensively, looks like he was the only senior with over 20 tackles at 47, and 6 of those being for loss. As far as if there ever was a year, it'd be this class of 25 that makes it possible, headlined by 4-year starter Casey Midcap, who almost went for 2,000 yards throwing and running the ball, while also passing for 8 scores and nearly doubling that on the ground. He will be joined once again by his tailback, as well as one of the top defenders in 1A, Sam Meisner here. He went ballistic last season, racking up 1,535 yards on 197 carries for 29 touchdowns on rushing alone. Not to mention his impact as a returner and a defender, notching over 2,000 all-purpose yards. Defensively, he led the team in total tackles and had laps with 73 total tackles, with 10.5 of those total tackles being in the backfield. They also will be returning Aaron Tina here, who made some athletic plays as part of 2 receivers, with him and Collins going for over 300 yards, but with Tenna catching 6 scores. Casey Midcap was second to Meisner on the defense with over 70 tackles, but his defense almost literally returns everybody here, with only 2 seniors recording any tackles. So I'd have to guess close to 98 or 99% of tackles coming back, as well as TFLs. Looking at Chapel here, who had 11.5 total TFLs. Turnovers with Austin Collins picking off the ball 4 times. Casey Midcap getting 3 interceptions and 5 pass breakups, and Sam Meisner getting 2. This pass defense is looking to be locked and loaded, and with a ton of blocked kicks coming back, this team is almost entirely intact as well as special teams and defense goes, and that makes them scary if they can get over the hump. So let's take a look at what this team is looking at currently, and let's discuss this schedule here. They have their first game on August 31st against Platte Canyon. That should probably be a win. They then play Goodland at home. That should be a win. Scott has gotten the best of this team over the past few years, but I think if there ever was a time where Wray could potentially win, it's as Scott graduates some seniors in a very successful season. Their last non-league game is against Brush in Brush. Honestly, Brush is going to be one of the top teams in 2A this year. This should be a pretty good game, honestly, and could be a very well-earned win. But even if they don't win it and they end up going 2-2 at worst in non-league play, that's not too bad because I have them favored over Holyoke. I have them favored over Burlington. And then against the Badgers, I mean, gosh, you would think that this would be the night that Wray beats Limon. All the chips seem like they're stacked in Wray's favor as far as returners go, as far as contributors go. And Casey Midcap still looking for his first win, I want to say, as a starter over Limon. So we'll see there. Then they should beat Yuma. And then Wiggins is going to be an interesting game as well. Look, this team, I think 5-4 would be the absolute floor, but I expect them to do better than that. I think that this team should go 7-2, honestly, if I have to give them an exact record total here, just with how competitive these games are. And I'm going to say a window of wins between 6 to 8 here, and put some pretty high expectations on the Eagles this year, who have all the ingredients of a championship caliber team, but they just need to follow through and get over that hump. Up next, we got Yuma here. Last year, they started off hot with back-to-back wins at a combined margin of 60-16 over Sterling and Burns, but they would not be as lucky over their next 3 contests, scoring only 7 points total against BLA, Brush, and Wiggins. They'd win the game that was necessary for any playoff hope, taking care of business against Burlington 38-12, but would lose out to close the season against Wray, Holyoke, and Limon. But the strength of schedule gods deemed them worthy at 3-6, in which case they played Gunnison and only lost by 2 scores to conclude the season. Ultimately, the offense was ineffective with one heavy lifter, and the defense was then on the field way too much, and that's going to lead to some problems. And so this year, they're hoping to get a few more contributors involved, as well as keep this defense off the field, or at least off the field longer than they were last year. But they're going to have their work kind of cut out for them as they do graduate Trey Stegman and Hugo Montez here. 112 total tackles between them, with Stegman blowing up plays a team high 9 times in the backfield. And in addition to that, this squad will also lose Carson Lynch, whose play on both sides of the ball definitely made wins possible on this squad. They also graduate Bridger Lynch, who is tied for second on the team with 2 interceptions, and then had sole possession of second in pass deflections with 4. As far as returning playmakers go, this offense primarily ran through the hands of 3 players in quarterback Jonathan Thompson, who had 928 rushing yards, 6 scores, and then 3 passing touchdowns to 6 picks, albeit. Silas Bakke here, 480 yards and 6 rushing touchdowns, and then Damian Kaczynski here, who had 456 rushing yards on 65 carries and a pair of scores, while also catching 264 yards and a score. You also get Sheffield here, who caught for over 140 yards and a team-high 2 touchdowns. So this offense is returning basically everyone important on the skill position front, so that's going to be huge, as well as a little bit of size. And then defensively, a handful of these names return, like Thompson, who led the team in tackles as a junior, as well as in interceptions, Kaczynski, who had a pair of TFLs, Bakke, who had 25 total tackles, and the defense also benefits from incoming juniors Rayleigh Trejo and Brody Sheffield here, who are the only underclassmen in the top 5 of total tackles last season. Overall, of players to record 20 or more tackles last season, this defense has 7 coming back, so this should be a little bit of a better year, you would think, for the Yuma Outlaws, it looks like, is what they're rolling with these days. And so let's go ahead and take a look at their schedule here. They do start off with an out-of-state game against Chase County here. That's from Imperial, Nebraska. This team was very, very good last year in Nebraska. I do hope that we represent well and we're able to steal a win here. But this was a pretty solid squad. Before they have Roaring Fork, that one is on the road, but I do think that they should win that game. Roaring Fork is a program that didn't get to play a varsity game last year, and so that's going to be tough. They then play one of the premier Wyoming squads in Torrington, but they do get that game at home, and Torrington also graduating a few contributors from last year before playing Brush to close out non-league. I think that 1-3 is fair expectations, but 2-2 would be fantastic over this stretch. Then got Burlington. They should probably win that game. And then Wiggins, I don't think that they win that one. Holyoke is a winnable game. And then Wray and Limon, I'm not as sure about. So I think that at best, this team could probably, in the best case scenario, go 5-4, but could be looking at 3-6 again. But I do think that 3-6 is way more valid than it was last year. So a window of wins of 3-5, but I'm going to project the final standings here of Yuma to be a 4-5 football team. And that does it for that league. Now we're going to go ahead and jump over to 1A League 6 here and talk about Manual High School. Last year, they were another 4-5 squad here in 1A who started off with a big win over Jefferson and then narrowly lost to Denver West by 4 before 2 tougher losses to La Junta and Grand Valley. They'd benefit from a forfeit win before Flatirons Academy would beat Manual in Westminster, and then they'd win a thrilling game at home versus Estes Park 44-32 and get another forfeit win before a tough loss to Highland ended their season. Look, 4-5 might have been good enough for some of the strength of schedule, but benefiting from 2 forfeits in that season definitely hurt the Thunderbolts here as they just had to keep rolling. And this team is losing a lot. That senior year was probably one of their better shots to make a push for the postseason. I mean, most of the offense, at least the weapons, that is, graduate as the top 4 receivers who all eclipsed 100 yards and caught touchdowns, all graduate in ascending order. You got Miles Johnson, who had 4 touchdowns on 184 yards. Deshaun Fox, who had 100 more yards than Johnson and 1 more receiving touchdown. Bay Gonzalez, who broke the 300 yards mark and scored twice. And then Diamante Maynard here, one of our premier PMC spotlights here, who led in every category with 23 catches for 515 yards and 8 scores. Not to mention running for another 200 yards and 2 scores. So definitely the go-to weapon last year. And then in the backfield, Antonio Gerriato was a senior and ran for the most scores last season with 3 rushing touchdowns. And the facilitator of this offense will be graduating as well. That is Cartel Dickey. He threw for 19 scores to just 7 picks and for 1,445 yards. Gerriato's contributions was also near the top of the leaderboard for total tackles here, along with Camarius Burton Ward, James Jackson, and Miles Johnson in the senior class. And then speaking of Burton Ward, he was an absolute game wrecker in the pass rush, making up for 2/3 of all sacks on this team with 12 of his own and a few hurries. Overall, only 2.5 sacks will be returning next year and will need to spike dramatically. For returning playmakers here, I do have to look at the leader in solo tackles, and I think tackles period, who is sophomore Kier Watson, who is definitely the leader in TFLs at 4 and will be joined by other sophomores such as Sir Conte, Harris Cook, Tyree Tolliver, Kiave Banks, and Hugo Gonzalez. And with the lack of junior presence on this defense or even this team, these guys are going to be asked to do a lot more here. And then Watson was also the leader in turnovers forced, who's returning, that is, having intercepted 2 passes and recovered a fumble. Let's go ahead and take a look at this window of wins here and this schedule for this year. So they start off against Ignacio at home. That should be a game that they should probably win, even with as few returners as they have. Denver West, I don't think that's a win. Mitchell, that could be a win, especially with it being at home. And then for the rest of the season, I'm not in love with some of these looks. Flatirons Academy, no. Highland, no. Versus the Pinnacle, maybe, but I think that the Pinnacle is actually returning a lot more people who had snaps last year. So I think that they could probably lose to the Pinnacle. I think that they lose to Platte Valley. Estes Park, I literally have no idea. I'll fill y'all in on there with what they're looking at. But Estes Park does have some intriguing defensive returners. And then at Jefferson, this might actually be the time where Jefferson could beat Manual, honestly. So, even if we take these potential could wins here, Manual could sneak into a 4-5 position. However, I do think that 3-6 is more reasonable and 2-7 is not even out of the question, if I'm being completely honest here. I'm actually going to go ahead and say 2-7 is my projected number here, and then the window of wins is 2-4 for the Thunderbolts. Staying in that league, we are going to talk about Estes Park here. Look, Estes last year, this team narrowly eclipsed 500 last season despite dropping 2 games early that I think could have been won. They lost Wellington 8-6 and then Middle Park 20-16, but they didn't dwell on it and won 2 crazy shootouts after that, scoring 46 and 44 respectively. They would then lose on the road in a unique little town, and they'd bounce back with a 50-point win and then lose another shootout-style game to Manual before a forfeit win from Sheridan provided them some rest to get one last win on the season over Flatirons Academy. As far as stats go, there was basically none for graduating seniors, but also just like none on offense. But as far as some returning playmakers that I could look at from defense, I look at Jack Stegeman and Santiago Salgado on defense, who had the most tackles combining between them, and Salgado recording 6 tackles for loss. There are also some freshmen and sophomore contributors from the likes of Colby O'Brien, who had 5 TFLs, and Adair Arvizu as well. So they're going to get some contributions back to their defense. Hopefully they record stats for their offense, but I'm not even going to waste my time like that. They allegedly have Sheridan scheduled for the very first week, so I wonder if this is only the JV schedule. I'm not entirely sure here. But let's go ahead and just read this schedule as it is right now. They have Middle Park. I don't think that they win that game. I don't know if they beat Denver Christian. Flatirons Academy on the road. I don't think they win that game. Peyton, I don't think they win. Highland, I don't think so. But then they have some pretty forgiving games here. Jefferson, the Pinnacle, and Manual. So even if they do get that win over like Middle Park and Denver Christian, I think at best they can win 5 games, and at worst they can win 2. So I'm going to give them a window of wins of 2-5 with the limited information that I have on Estes Park. And we have reached the pinnacle, and by the pinnacle, I mean the program here for my season previews. Last year, they had some younger players getting snaps, and it showed as Pinnacle lost every game with the exception of a forfeit win over Sheridan. And they only scored twice last season, but on the flip side of that, they are returning a ton of players here, as they really only graduated Alex Hoffman, Alfredo Zamudio, Moctezuma here, who were the only seniors to get double-digit tackles. Hoffman was also the leader in interceptions with 2 and the only senior contributor to go for over 100 scrimmage yards on offense. That was courtesy of the receiving threat that he provided. As far as returning playmakers go, they bring back Omar Torones Hara here, who is the lead back, rushing for 260 yards in just 7 games, and was complemented by sophomore back Yadir Perez, who had 227 yards himself. Omar here also caught for over 100 yards and 1 score here, and the primary passer who connected those dots last season was sophomore Humberto Chavez here, who threw 2 scores to 4 picks. They also bring back Sammy Morales here, who led the team with 4 pass deflections, and then Charlie Martin was the only player with an interception who comes back. And last but not least, they bring back Marcus Martinez Louvan here, who led the team in solo and total tackles and will return with the top 6 players in tackles here. Looking ahead to the schedule, they have a very tough week 1 against Peyton on the road. They then play Alameda at home. That is an interesting and winnable matchup, I would say, for this team here, but that could go either way. They then play Mitchell on the road, and then at home versus Prospect Ridge Academy and Jefferson here, and then Manual on the road, and then at Estes Park. This is a pretty forgiving schedule, I would say. Outside of that Peyton game is really the only one I don't think that they should win. But I think that they probably just split these games and go somewhere along the lines of 3-6 to a 5-4 even potentially. So I'm going to say a window of wins. I'm going to go one below and one up high, 2-5. I'm going to say a projected final record of 3-6 for the Pinnacle. And that'll do it for Kodey Stoffer's. That's me. Season previews here. Be sure to listen to Coach V's previews that he wrapped up a little bit ago, as well as Gino V. Hill's previews. Those are all prior to this episode. And then be sure to stay tuned for Gideon's previews here coming up, where we have gone through every single team, 1A through 5A. We've given you our thoughts. We've talked about the players who are coming back according to the information that we have. We encourage teams to keep putting information into Max Preps. Please, please, please get onto Huddle, upload your film, give us something to look at here so that way we can properly evaluate your team and how you're going to do for the upcoming season. But that is going to do it for myself here. You can listen to all of those episodes that I mentioned, both past, present, and future, anywhere you listen to podcasts, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or YouTube. All of those, you just look up Playmakers Corner on the platform and you will find us. Subscribe and turn on notifications to find out when all of the latest episodes come out, or go ahead and follow us on social media, whether that's Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, which is all Playmakers Corner, or if you're on Twitter/X, go and follow us at Playmaker Corner for all of our episode covers, as well as other interesting content like highlights, watch lists, power rankings, and so much more that we have in store for you, especially this fall season as we cover middle school tackle football, Colorado tackle football, and Colorado flag football on the girls level. We are so excited and have so much in store for you. I have been your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, signing off for 24 previews on The Last Time. Peace.